Hello, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you're joining us from the world. My name is Theo Achiampo, and I am a visiting fellow at the Africa Policy Research Institute, which is based in Berlin, Germany. We warmly welcome you to this session where we're going to discuss issues to do with the outcomes of COP27 in terms of how we finance Africa's climate agenda. But before we proceed any further, I'd like to make a couple of logistical announcements, and then I will introduce the team of the webinar, and then, of course, our excellent list of speakers that we have who would share their thoughts and insights on the issue for us. The first quick point to notice that this webinar is being recorded and it would be made available on the APRI website in the coming days. And then also after we have the panel discussion, we will have an opportunity for some Q&A. So please prepare your questions while our experts are sharing their thoughts or discussing. But you can also post your questions in the chat box and do make sure that you indicate the person that you want the question addressed to. And I will do my very best to get them through to our panelists for them to answer. So we do know that climate finance is undoubtedly one of the most significant challenges facing the continent, especially when it comes to the gap that is required to finance adaptation. It is estimated that across the continent, you need about 250 billion, and that's even at the lower end of the scale over the next 10 years to implement all of the wonderful plans that countries have developed as part of their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Climate Agreement. And at APRI, we have been researching on these issues. Last year, we did publish a landmark study in the lead up to COP27 that sought to examine and unpack the landscape when it comes to climate finance. We looked at three countries, South Africa, Zambia, and Ghana, to see how the architecture of these countries have helped, or you may even argue hindered, in the delivery of climate finance in these respective countries. And we will share a link to the report as we continue this conversation. Then COP happened in November of last year. There were a couple of outcomes from COP, one of which was the financing for loss and damage. 2 months down the line, we've had a chance to reflect, and we want to have this session with our esteemed colleagues and my discussants and panelists who actually gratefully worked with APRI on publishing and undertaking that report, really to understand what COP27 did and what sort of it means for climate financing in Africa for this year and beyond as we go into COP28 in the United Arab Emirates and the subsequent years to come. So I do have a wonderful list of discussants with me, and I'm going to quickly introduce them, and then we will delve straight into our conversation that we have for the day. So in order of how I see them on my screen, we have Dr. Britta Renkamp. Britta is a senior visiting fellow also at APRI, but she does spend her time doing a lot of work with the African Climate and Development Initiative at the University of Cape Town. And I'm sure Britta also wears a couple of other hats as well. So Britta, you're welcome. We also have Mulima Nyambe Mubanga. Mulima is based in Zambia. She's also one of our visiting fellows here at APRI, and she is affiliated with the Zambian Institute for Policy Analysis based in Lusaka. Mulima, you're welcome. And then lastly, I do have Charles Ofori, Jemfi Ofori. Charles is also a visiting fellow with APRI, and Charles works with the Africa Center for Energy Policy, also based in Accra, Ghana, where he is the head of policy and leads their climate program as well. So, gentlemen and ladies, you're welcome. And I hope we would have an interesting time. I am particularly looking forward to your thoughts on these issues and how, as a continent, we would be able to position ourselves to get the financing that is required, be it mitigation or adaptation, or now loss and damage. So perhaps maybe let me start with you, Charles, if you don't mind. Given the outcomes at COP and actually even going into COP, I wonder from where you sit, how are or where African governments defining and you may say using the notion of, climate finance? What goals were they using when it comes to climate finance from an African perspective? I think you're muted, Charles, so you might have to unmute.
Okay, I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much, Theo. I see the definition of Africa in terms of climate financing to be encompassing a certain key items. First of all, when you look at the operational definition for climate financing based on the biennial assessment for the 2014 biennial assessment, the definition was generally focused at reducing emissions, enhancing sinks of greenhouse gases, without really pointing out who was responsible for what. And generally, the Africans' notion of the key elements of the climate financing indicated that they do not agree with the validity of such a definition. That doesn't really highlight what the financing is responsible for, who is responsible for paying, and what financial instruments are being used. So the definition for Africa took note of the focus on adaptation, focus on mitigation, focus on response, focus on resilience, and also focus on technology transfer. And they also focused on activities that are more country-driven, in the sense that the definition of the operational definition of climate financing in the sense of the African group actually looked at it in terms of that, although the financing may not come from them, the activities, they are supposed to call the shots on what activities should be focused on, so that if the country's impact is largely on adaptation or on improving resilience, then they would focus on those activities. And the financing definition was also largely focused on financial instruments, key financial instruments, including grants and then concessional funding. And the responsibility of finance was actually placed on developed countries. So generally, there's a very long definition by the African group on climate financing, but then basically the focuses were on financial resources that were provided by developed countries, also focusing on ensuring that these finances are in line with the needs of identified developing countries, and those financing should also reflect a certain level of progression. And key among this was that it should be on a grant and concessional basis, as I've already stated. Now, if you compare and contrast this kind of definition by the African group to other institutions, you realize that they are a bit different. Whilst the Africa is concerned largely on who is financing that, or concerned on developed countries financing, and then also financing based on grants and concessional basis. An institution like the International Institute for Environment and Development looks at it on the basis of creating an innovative capacity, creating some form of business incubation, creating some form of influence, and demonstrating a certain business case for building the confidence of investors and de-risking investments across different financing flows. So this definition actually looks at the responsibility of whatever country there is to really create an environment that attracts business and supports the concept of financing to support green businesses and also to take climate action and to incentivize, groups and businesses that are responsible for climate action. Now, comparing this with African, you see quite a very stark differences in how we see climate action, and I believe that is what leads us into identifying what are the key things that Africa does in order to secure the necessary financing. So these things are key, and I believe that maybe in subsequent discussions we'll be able to discuss some of these things. But when it comes to definition, these are the key tenets of the Africa definition.
Brilliant, brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much. That's quite a lot in there, I must say. You talk about the financing being tied to activities, and it needs to reflect sort of the underlying needs of the country, and reflect a certain level of progression. And you contrast that with other definitions by other sort of organizations, where it talks about creating some sort of innovation and that sort of entrepreneurial space. But I wonder, Britta, coming to you, how do these, in a sense, reflect, or how in, say, South Africa, climate finance needs are assessed, and to what extent they are sort of administered within South Africa, but then you can, of course, extract that to what happens at the continental level.
Yeah, thank you very much, Theo, for that question, and also thank you for the introductions and Charles's answer about the contestations when it comes to the definitions of climate finance. And I think that answer already frames a lot of the implementation issues around it, because the definitions really vary, and not just at the international level, as Charles had referred to, but also nationally. So just to give you an example, in South Africa, there's been contestations around what counts that's being reported as climate finance within the NDCs. There was a lot of reporting of private investments into renewable energy that were reported as climate finance. And that really brings with other actors may have contested that and think it's like public finance that should be counted. And it's basically the framing of this definition often comes down to the polarization that you find between public and private finance, and which of those count. And a lot of that then comes down to the politics of climate finance as well, because how much of a role do you give the private sector in this, which is very critical. But then there's also the political stance on that to make a cause for public finance, for provision of public goods. And that also brings us to the field of mitigation versus adaptation versus loss and damage finance. And South Africa has quite an imbalance when it comes to climate finance in terms of mitigation. The vast majority of climate finance goes into the mitigation part, given the high burden of emissions that comes from the industrial sector in South Africa, coal-based electricity system, and so forth. But it also means that renewable energy we kind of know how to operate climate finance in that space, because there's a market, you can define the market, investors can count on their returns and so forth. Whereas in adaptation finance is less marketable, so to say, and loss and damage even more. So there's that question then, what is the role for private versus public finance, and what is it that you actually ask for? And that brings me to the second part, where you ask about reporting and assessing those needs. because you want to definitely avoid dead weights, so in this problem. So you want to be sure that you fund what's needed and what are the criteria to assess those. And there are those green taxonomies coming forth, which help to identify climate finance, sustainable development finance, where there's a lot of criteria for what it is that they do. And there's the European one that's come out, and there's also a process underway for South African one, and that might be something to look at also into other African countries. Having said that, you want to keep the reporting quite simple. You don't want to overweigh it. And that's something that we've seen in the transparency mechanism, so that enhanced framework on transparency. You can see that developing countries, or so many African countries, don't keep up with the reporting. So you have that kind of like trade-off of, want to know what's needed, but you also don't want to over-report, because then you don't actually get, if the requirements are too strict or rigorous, then you may end up with no reporting at all. So there's a fine line to be struck between all of these considerations. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, no, very, very, very interesting about the fine line that needs to be struck, but also the important point you made about what counts as climate finance in the context of the NDCs and private versus government versus other flows. But you touched on a point about your last one point about what's needed in the respective countries, and I want to maybe bring in Mulima from sort of where you said in a Zambia context, but also extending that to the African continent. Where or in which areas do you find are the most pressing needs when it comes to climate finance? So we could break this down by the kind of three main areas, or even two if we stick with adaptation and mitigation. Over.
Thank you, Theo. So I'll just basically start by saying that the climate change impacts continue to negatively impact economic growth in many countries. So there's a case for seeking climate finance to sectors such as agriculture, tourism, and energy to enforce the mitigation and adaptation measures. Now, when you look at most of the African countries, we rely heavily on agriculture, and it's largely rain-fed agriculture. So when we talk about the climate financing, is to help largely the smallholder farmers to transition to utilizing irrigation farming. That's for one. And then there's also now talk of utilization of renewable energy. And that's something that is being promoted back here in Zambia, trying to utilize renewable energy, other renewable energy sources from hydropower to solar power and wind, geothermal, and biomass. Now, you will know that some of these aspects are quite a challenge when you say we are aware of the needs, the mitigation and adaptation needs. But for the financing, it's quite difficult to access. So while we know that this is where the pressing areas that we need to target the financing, is it something that is doable? And I also want to share that now we're also, there's conversation around sustainable transport. We're talking about e-mobility and utilization of electric vehicles, and just to say that this is something that is quite topical for the country like Zambia, but we are seeing that there's that trajectory to move towards sustainable transport, and these are some of the issues I think which were actually being discussed also at the COP. So when you want to delve into other aspects, when you talk about the climate financing adaptation, so you also look at sectors like water, Then you also talk about the buildings and the infrastructure. That's where we need the financing. Then for mitigation, I've already spoken about agriculture, but I also wanted to add forestry and other land use, basically the follow sector. That's where we need much of the financing. So there's the deforestation rates are quite alarming in the region, and most people don't have access to electricity. So you find that we use wood fuel. So how do we mitigate against that? So you're talking about trying to come up with alternative sources of livelihood for most of the people, particularly in the rural areas. But I always say that what is surprising when we talk about averting the deforestation, in as much as we have measures even from cooperative partners where they talk about scaling down on deforestation, but the biggest players who are culprits to the charcoal consumption is the urban areas. So in a nutshell, the pressing needs are largely in the follow sector. Then you talk about the energy sector also, and now we're talking about the sustainable transport. Thank you.
Well, so that's quite a lot of sectors, and I guess sometimes one would wonder how do we prioritize them from agriculture to transport to buildings to energy within the mitigations sphere, but also like again in adaptation when it comes to supporting some of the smallholder farmers in that regard. And that leads me to a second set of questions coming across the table once again. One which is that in the lead up to COP27 and of course thereafter as well, the narrative or the narrative has been that we need to acknowledge Africa's special or unique financing circumstances, but also its special circumstances in terms of where it sits with the impact of climate change, some of which, Mulima, you've talked about. So for the purposes of perhaps our audience, it'll be useful just to give a little context to this. This is the continent that has contributed the least in or to global climate change. If you actually tallied up all of the cumulative emissions of the African continent, it actually was less than 4% of total greenhouse gases as of 2020. In the same breath, when you work out the emission trends on a per capita basis, so basically you divide that by your population size, you see that with Africa, it's kind of barely increased over the last 3 decades, despite the continent's population also increasing by about twofold, which sort of indicates the existence of energy poverty on the continent in that sense. So I want to come back to you, Britta. These special circumstances, to what extent were they kind of reflected in the sort of African view at COP, or you may even extend that to kind of the South African, position, and going forward into COP28 and subsequent other events, what needs to be changed to sort of reflect this in the type and the architecture of the financing flows?
Yeah, thank you, Theo, for that question. I think it's important to acknowledge that the UNFCCC system is just one platform where climate finance takes place. It's definitely an important one. And I think the COP has been very important in convening this discussion. And I think the fact that it took place in Africa actually helped a lot to put African issues on the agenda. I mean, it's always hard to prove the counterfactual, but I don't think the loss and damage discussion would have advanced to a stage where it was if it hadn't been in Africa. So I think, I mean, acknowledging that it is a COP and it operates within its own constraints of the international negotiations and the multilateral system, it's been successful in advancing the African agenda, especially loss and damage, where industrialized countries had been very defensive and cautious about. And I think institutionally, it's been a big step. Whether the fund is going to get filled again is a different question. What the climate goals that have been set back to from Cancun actually mean if we keep missing the targets, the $100 million target and so forth. If that continues to happen, then there's that bigger question of what it means. And I think the COP was particularly I don't know, marking in the fact when it ended the next day, it was the opening of the Qatar World Cup, which had cost like twice it had cost twice the climate finance target, which had been missed for the last 10 years. So I think in that context, you really need to see the negotiations are doing one part, but it's not enough and it can't be enough. And the way that it's framed and translated into the public is also not really working very well. I mean, I think we're trying our best, but if you read through those decisions, you really need to understand the history of each of the decisions to translate them into what it actually means. So I think it's to make this successful, it needs to leverage engagement at all levels. And I think historically over time, we've seen movements towards more polycentric climate finance governance. And there are more stakeholders engaged, and there are more mechanism toward blended finance and entries for private sector engagement. But I think if we look into the institutional dynamics of how climate governance has evolved over time, we're not at the tipping point where it's enough. So when it comes to the technological regime that we're wanting to change in terms of renewables, reducing fossil fuels, but also things like, Mulima has mentioned electric vehicles, which again need more renewables to actually work out in terms of life cycle, in terms of hydrogen, which is a big topic, but it also only works if renewables work. There's so many contingency of like transitions. And I think that's really important to focus on that battle and to really make it conducive so that change can happen, that private sector, private households, and everybody who can adopt renewables can do that, that the governments subsidize where they can and don't, prevent that change and pull back into other subsidizing, continue to subsidize fossil fuels. And I think there are dynamics also with divestment and the coal industries and so forth, but now with the security architecture, the war in Ukraine, all of that, I think there's been a big setback in that dynamic. And also the European, the German government with the exemptions of temporarily moving back into fossil fuels and building new fossil fuel infrastructure, even if it's gas, it's not helping, and it's really derailing the progress and sending not good messages into the developing world, because then the questions asked in African countries, but also India and so forth, to say why are we doing this if you guys are doing something else is very legitimate. And also the idea of an energy crisis is obviously, like in Europe, then translated this into Africa, where there's a lot of people living in a lot worse conditions with a lot less and still struggling to even get access. I think these are all notions that need to be taken into account. And there we need to really, in addressing those battles, we need to be very careful in the way that we phrase needs for finance, because we still have a whole big development agenda on the continent that needs to be attended, and that a lot of this finance can also help to do. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, very interesting. Coming from you, and it raises quite a number of other sort of interesting questions, particularly in the context of the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war and the sort of shift. Some may argue temporary. Some may say maybe it's going to be last with us for a while, where a number of European or Western nations have decided to sort of go back to using some of these fossil fuel forms to meet their energy security needs and aspirations. And that some African countries have also been arguing for a while that, they want to develop, using whatever energy resources that they have at their continent. I want to come to you, Mulima. We've been talking a while about, climate financing and related matters. But from an African point of view and where you sit, do you see sort of a unified Pan-African strategy driving some of the negotiations that have been happening at before COP, at COP, and thereafter? And do these sort of financing strategies in a way reflect the continent's, aspirations and unique circumstances, some of which Britta has highlighted earlier?
Thank you for the question. It's an interesting one. So when you look at the African group of negotiators, or they actually unified in making sure that we end up with financial mechanisms that would unlock financial access at scale, and also just predictable funding for climate action on affordable and reasonable terms. And I'm sure you're aware that most of the African countries are in dire fiscal distress. So if the climate finance is loans and equity financing, some of the countries have challenges. I'm sure you're aware that for a country like Zambia, we're already defaulting on our debt repayment. So like Britta said, yes, fine, we have the loss and damage aspect, but is it enough? I know we've been pushing for it for more than 30 years, but when you look at the architect of the climate financing, where it's coming from, one of the aspects that we established, and it's something that is being discussed even back home here, is even the ability to put up bankable projects to access that financing. So that's one end. And then secondly, whilst we are aware of where we need to address, to target the financing, it's also just the technical capabilities of how we utilize the funding. So granted, the NDCs already guide in terms of what we need to do. For Zambia, I think we even have an implementation strategy with respect to the NDC. Now it goes back down to, do all the countries have that? So in as much as we have, we came up with a position as a country, we said we needed to make sure that climate financing, the finances are available. We got the loss and damage funding mechanism established. And I want to play devil's advocate. Whilst I know I'm jumping the gun here, but I just thought that we talk about the negotiation position that they went with. So we came out with the loss and damage. Is it going to help us attain all our mitigation and adaptation prospects as set out in our NDCs? And secondly, in as much as there's need to establish a transitional committee, to operationalize the new funding arrangements under the loss and damage. I always say the burden of proof will be a bit difficult because I'm sure you're aware for certain countries, when you talk about the infrastructure, what if it was put up using maybe the contractors did a shoddy job, forgive my language, but then you come and say it was caused by climate change. So those are the aspects. So yes, it's a win, but then when you look at how we will operationalize the loss and damage and even just the mechanisms to access the funding, I'm waiting to see how that will play out. And I'm saying this against the background of even just access to the Green Climate Fund. I mean, that's a bit tedious. It's an onerous process, goes back to the bankability of the project. So whilst we are alive to the fact that we need the climate financing, how we access the funding, the process shouldn't be tedious. It's quite critical. And we need the money like yesterday, secondly. But then even when the funds come, how it's utilized also remains to be questioned. It's something that I think as a continent, we need to make sure that our M&E systems are in place, because it's, I don't know about other countries, but we have a lot of interventions from both the government partners, the civil society organizations, the government, all trying to address one thing. So there's a lot of financing that is available, and people are working on one thing, but we don't really see the outcomes. So whilst we came out with a win, and then this in a way reflected a unified strategy that reflects the unique circumstances of the continent. But I always want to say that it's not a one size fits all. So each country will have different ways of approaching this, but we need to make sure that it's utilized in a manner that is beneficial to the countries as per their national circumstance. Yeah.
Thank you. There's one thing you said that kind of struck out to me. You said that there is some funding available, but sometimes it's disconnected from the outcomes. And then you also talk about when it comes to the new loss and damage facility, there's a lot more work that would need to go into that in terms of, you know, the burden of proof and things like that. But Charles, I want to bring you in here, just leveraging Mulime's last couple of points about the barriers to climate financing. In the report that we APRI issued last year in the lead up to COP, there were a number of these barriers that were highlighted or identified, from finance to governance to social barriers, and even things around skills and infrastructure. I just want to get your sort of take on this. Did these barriers, in a sense, get featured at those sort of discussions and the, you know, and the outcomes at the last climate conference? And going forward, what do we do to, you know, overcome these barriers such that we actually get the flows coming in? Like Mulima said, we need the money as of yesterday. I probably would say we even needed the money as of last year or 10 years ago. Over.
All right. So as Mulima has indicated, I mean, there have been several barriers that we have noted. But again, the conversations on climate financing has in several COPs, and this COP has not been any different, was huge on the need to provide the necessary financing. And most of the conversation has centered on, again, the need for developed countries to provide the needed financing for development, and that is good. I mean, yeah, right from the introductory statements on the fact that, you know, Africa contributes less, and not just Africa, but also other developing nations in other regions. I mean, less contributions per capita contribution is quite almost negligible, and we bearing the brunt of the impact, and when it comes to vulnerability and all of that. So in response to that, there is going to be a loss and damage fund whose technicalities and operationalizations are going to be, you know, structured out subsequently. But then we are still left with tackling the key challenges of how to access some of these finances that is available. And if you check our reports, I mean the APRI reports, you would realize that the capacity issues are still a very key issue that Africa and other developing economies needs to deal with. Much as there is limited financing, much as we do not have so much money in the funds, much as the developed nations haven't fulfilled their pledges, there's also the question of how far have we gone in accessing the little that is within the climate funds. For instance, for Ghana, how much have we been able to access from the GEF, from the GCF and other big ticket climate funds? And what are the challenges? And the challenges has likely got to do with our lack of capacity to do that. The data availability to make a case for us to get the funding is not there. As Molima said, how are we going to even attribute the infrastructure requirements to whether it's just our own personal mishaps or it's as a result of climate change? All of these things needs to be justified, and because there's a grant-based type of funding, you cannot just go for the funds to give you the money. You need to provide a very good justification, a very good assessment of your capacities, a very good level of information that justifies your collection of the millions of dollars that are relevant for your climate action. And so we need to now begin to look at the other soft issues that are in itself perhaps soft, but they have quite a huge impact on our ability to access the limited funds. We need to be able to strengthen some of our financial intermediaries who can act as, you know, good intermediaries for even small green businesses to be able to access the fund. Now there is a report by the Technology Executive Committee on encouraging climate technology transfer and technical assistance. How are we going to take advantage of that? And Molima talked about, you know, bankable projects, building capacity and all of that. How those are the conversations that should also be highlighted. Yes, we can still continue to hound and pound on developed countries to provide the necessary financing, but we should also ensure that there is more room for improvement to deal with the other factors. So we still have key questions emerging. If there is $1 trillion or let's say $2 quadrillion in the fund that everybody can access, have we built the necessary capacity to access it? And if we do not have that capacity to access it, then the funds will be there, but Africa will still be at where it is in doing so. So the capacity and then the other infrastructure issues were less mentioned, but those are the things that also needs to be highlighted in subsequent discussion, not just at COP. We don't have to wait till it's another COP, but it should be a national conversation and it should be a national action that is being taken. And if we're able to link these climate conversations to our general economic development, we will be able to see the need for financing, and we'll be able to be very innovative in attracting the necessary financing that will be helpful for Africa. Over.
All right, thank you very much. You're hammering on the capacity issues, and some have also sort of raised the point there that perhaps the processes for accessing these global funds are a bit too cumbersome for countries, and the process of even proving or making your case sometimes is quite challenging or difficult in that regard. So perhaps there's an opportunity there to fine tune and make those processes less burdensome, and that allows countries to access these funds. I want to come around the table for maybe a final round of conversations and take home points. And I want us to be a bit forward looking now in terms of other innovative sort of ways or mechanisms that we can get more flows coming to the continent within both the COP and the UNFFCC system, but also outward of that. Mulima, you made a point very much earlier on about the fact that a number of African countries are already struggling with their fiscal finances, and therefore there's a need for sort of more grant-based instruments and concessional loans and the likes, which would not or do not exacerbate their debt service and fiscal vulnerability. So I want to come around the table, starting with Britta. Off the back of the South African just energy transition plan, and you can give us a bit of context or a bit of detail around that. What other sort of innovative ways are you seeing countries push or advocate for when it comes to getting more of these flows coming in, but in a way that does not impose undue debt burdens on them?
Thank you very much, Theo, for that question. A very important question. So I think the main question is to really understand what kind of finance flows can be transformative, and transformative in both like developmental outcomes, but also technological change, right? So what actually works? Because as Charles also said, it's not throwing money at a problem. It needs a lot of capacity to absorb it, spend it well. And I think that's pretty much just the main challenge that we're seeing. So I think you need to be able to think big and structurally at the same time at thinking small and in the detail, and make sure that the funds go to those who can actually manage and absorb them for the purpose that they were intended for. So when I say think big, I think there are already a lot of things in place that could be firmed up in terms of criteria for climate finance along the divestment, strategies and plans and indicators, where you ask companies for carbon disclosure, for example, and you invest in those, and like bigger infrastructural needs that, like, for example, transmission lines and so forth, but to make sure that renewables get influx and that governments can't use like those investments as an excuse to not invest in renewables, for example. But then also thinking small in terms of, especially when it comes to grants, so that you give it to groups, organizations, communities that can actually absorb them and manage them in a way that it's changing. And there's a lot of research that's actually still going into that to really understand what that means. One of our projects is looking into that to understand transforming inequalities through inclusive climate action, how climate finance and projects are being implemented, with what intention, at what level, and so forth. So I think that's pretty much a lot of the challenges that we see. I think there are a lot of systems in place that can already be used, but it's really important to make it proof for any misuse and corruption. And that is a big problem. And that's also something that we see in the JETP, which is the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which is very critical and innovative. And a lot of it came out of South Africa's Eskom, the utility, to write off their debt and reuse it, and it's become a lot bigger roadmap, which is great because it's a sort of like an implementation plan for the NDC, and it's been a lot of work in making that happen. But on the other hand, you see that utility is being looted at the same time. The CEO in December just barely survived a poisoning attempt because the corrupt practices are under threat. And that is a reality that we need to acknowledge and face, and something we can't shy away from in talking this. If you then look within Africa, South Africa, on the US, for example, investment radar, it's still one of the better investment climates, because the same, let's call it, it's another pandemic really, is on the continent. And you want to be sure that if you get climate finance from the north, it's still someone else's loaf of bread, just in another part of the world. It's still tax money that you need to account for. So it can't just go into the wrong pockets. And I think that's the main thing, that it needs disclosure, it needs transparency, and it needs scales with individuals who can take the responsibility to ensure that the money goes to where it's intended.
Awesome. Thank you very much. You talk about it needs disclosure, transparency, money must go to where it's intended. You also say we need to think big and structurally, and that also the details, matter. I want to come to you, Mulima, for your thoughts on this same question as well. Other innovative financial mechanisms that we can deploy. One of the interesting things that is being pushed strongly is also the whole idea of debt for climate or debt for nature sort of swaps that allows countries to still finance their NDCs and meet all those climate sort of related obligations. And yeah, I just want to get your thoughts on this issue as well. Over.
Thank you for that. It's very interesting, and I like that it's a civil society organizations that are pushing this, and back here it's the WWF program that is pushing the debt for swap aspect. So it's quite important that this one is actualized, and I want, as Britta was speaking, I was agreeing with most of the things she said, and I wanted to also add another component, that even as we're trying to make sure that the climate financing is targeted to the right areas, but Theo, I think we even had this discussion when you were here. Even as much as we are waiting for the developed countries to come to the table and fulfill their pledges, we need to be alive to the fact that we have crisis globally. There's the COVID pandemic, and of course, there's the looming food crisis. So the developed countries won't be so willing to bring the money to the table. Back home, we are starting to look inwards. So how do we localize the climate financing? I think that's something that we should start having this conversation among the low middle income countries. Zambia just launched the green bond, and then we are seeing the uptake is yet to take off, but we're seeing that the private sector is very keen to take part in it. The commercial banks, there's a wave now back here where the commercial banks are now trying to understand how they can package their financing, not from the ordinary loans that they give, the personal loans. They're now trying to see how they can come up with the climate financing and make it affordable. But how do we make sure that we also avoid the greenwashing? That's one bit. So for me, when you talk about, I'm agreeable with the disclosure and transparency, but we need to have the systems and mechanisms, and it goes back also to the capacities for the different stakeholders, the different actors in the climate finance space. Who is responsible for doing what, and how can they, and who is eligible to access the financing? So all those measures need to be in place. So it should be structured. So for me, right now I'm championing looking inwards, putting up the bankable projects. Yes, even here when we localize the climate financing, it will still be difficult. Then at sub-national level also, I think this is something that has been on my mind. We need to also talk about the climate financing at sub-national level. So how do we roll that one out? So for a country like Zambia, we're pursuing a decentralized agenda. So we now have constituent development funds that we're talking about. So how does the local government come into play? Because remember that because agriculture is a mainstay for the country also here, it would be good to, the localized climate finance should be channeled to the sub-national level. So you have funds that are sourced by the local government, which are channeled to, if it's agriculture, you're trying to empower the smallholder farmers to practice the climate smart agriculture. And then if you're talking about the energy sector, because they're not connected to the grid, can we talk about access to solar? It's costly, but then just for purposes of lighting. So you start mitigating some of these aspects. So for me, the climate financing should just go, the sources should go beyond the multilateral level. Can we also now start looking inwards and even as we are formulating, Zambia is formulating a green growth strategy. So those are some of the things that we want to look at since we're transitioning to a green economy. So what does that mean? Which also now translates into how do we source the climate financing? So on the one hand, for projects or finance investments in the energy sector, you need huge capital investments there. But then when you bring it to the sub-national level, I think we need to talk about the localizing the climate financing. But then because we are in dire distress, many countries are in fiscal distress. So how do you strike that balance on the one hand, and then also making sure that the capacities are built to ensure that we actually utilize the climate financing well, goes to the places or targeted to aspects or sectors that actually need it. So that's that from me. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. You talk about one thing that struck out to me, greenwashing, but you also bring in the green bonds and the need to decentralize the flows down to the subnational level as well. Charles, I want to get your thoughts on this, and then we'll wrap up our conversation. Over to you.
All right, thank you. I think that it has been most welcoming to see commitments from the West, and COP27 has also brought about so many commitments and new pledges, increasing adaptation fund, increasing least development countries fund, increasing special climate fund, new replenishments in the global environmental fund. And as Mulima and Britta have already indicated, these things are important, but then there must be a lot of action on the part of developed countries. But it's really high time we, as Africa, began to chart our course and to be very innovative when it comes to climate financing. And I think that our definition should begin to also include some of the issues that have been highlighted by some of the international organizations in terms of how are we being innovative, how are we able to carry local businesses along how are we going to carry them, along? How are we going to create an environment that attracts investment? I mean, Britta mentioned something that is very thought-provoking, that the funds from the West are also somebody's bread and butter money, and much as indeed they are obliged to give, it's not within our control to getting those funds. But then we continue to suffer, and if you have to build adaptive capacities, we have to ensure that we are also innovative around the way we source the money, in the sense that even if the funding, we are not able to generate the required capacity to access the funds. Even if you're not able to get the required funds coming in, we are able to charge our own costs to access funds. And that also speaks to how we see this whole clean energy and energy transition, and how it affects us. How are we able to define the technologies that are relevant within our own environment, and how are we going to ensure that the local investor, the local bank, is able to finance some of these things. So we can look inward to bring about that innovation. We can look at how our regulatory processes are, and if they are so burdensome and there are a lot of bottlenecks, how do we loosen them up to ensure that there is so much innovation that revolves, and money that revolves around the system. And when we begin to open up and we begin to see this whole conversation around transition as opportunities for Africa to develop, I believe that we can begin to really realize the benefits, and then raise the necessary financing for that. So the one thing that was lacking was very good business models towards adaptive financing, and that's a challenge. We need to build capacities in that. Talking about the bankable projects, when we talk of adaptation, what kinds of business models are we building to really meet our adaptation goals? It's so easy to build certain business models for mitigation, but we need to begin to look at how we can build business models for adaptation, how we can raise money, and that money can also become revolving in the sense that they can generate the necessary income that's also relevant for domestic revenue mobilization. Financial intermediaries must also build that adequate capacity, and to ensure that the funds, when they're able to access funds from our global environment funds and our GCFs and co, those funds can also trickle down to smaller green businesses that do not have the capacity to access those funds. So if we are able to put our hands on deck, I think that it is possible for Africa to really meet our climate financing goals.
Thank you. I like the last note you finished on, that we need all hands on deck, and there are a lot of take-home points that have been raised and highlighted. But I just want to, on this note, thank excellent panel for this very interesting conversation. So thank you, Mulima. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Britta, for making the time to join us for this conversation on climate financing in the context of the last COP and what we do going forward. I have really thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, and I would like to thank my colleagues also at the Africa Policy Research Institute for putting this program together and for bringing the very brilliant minds around the table to discuss the topic. I hope, and I'm sure we all share these sentiments, that we will begin to transcend some of the big grand statements and begin to align the financing with the broader development needs of our respective countries on the continent, and ultimately create sustainable jobs and opportunities for our people. Thank you all very much for staying with us. I do not see any questions and answers, if I'm not mistaken. So at this point, we'll just wrap up, and we look forward to seeing you on our next podcast and webinar here at APRI. Thank you all very much, and we do appreciate it.